After the sudden death of the family patriarch, the old Dawson estate becomes filled with silence, secrets, and growing tension. Everything changes when the will is read, and instead of the expected inheritance, the children discover their father's surprising final wishes. But behind that lies a deeper truth they're not prepared to face. A truth that could shatter old illusions and give them one last chance to rebuild what's been broken. Fragments of Legacy. The Dawson family home, a sprawling Tudor revival nestled in the oldest part of Maplewood, had always been a bastion of strength and order. But in the week following Arthur Dawson's sudden death, the house seemed to be holding its breath. The air, usually alive with the scent of Margaret's roses and the faint, pleasant smell of old books and wood smoke, was now stagnant, thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. Arthur, the family's unshakable patriarch, was gone, and in his absence, the grand house felt less like a home and more like a beautifully appointed mausoleum, housing a fortune, an estate, and a family slowly beginning to fracture under the weight of unspoken resentments. Margaret Dawson, a woman whose grace had always been the quiet engine of the family, moved through the echoing halls like a ghost. She straightened picture frames, plumped cushions that no one sat on, and tried desperately to anchor her family in the turbulent sea of their collective grief. Her 3 children, however, were adrift in their own currents. Blake, the eldest, a man forged in his father's ambitious image, saw the future as a series of strategic moves. His grief was real, but it was interwoven with an impatient anxiety about the will. He prowled the study, his phone a permanent extension of his hand, his voice a low, urgent hum of business that felt profane in the quiet house. Lucy, the middle child, had always been the family's heart. She was the nurturer, the peacemaker, the one who remembered birthdays and soothed fevers. Now, she poured her anxiety into caring for her mother, brewing endless cups of tea and fielding condolence calls. But beneath her placid surface, a lifetime of self-doubt churned. She had sacrificed her own career ambitions to be the dutiful daughter, always standing in the long shadows cast by her father and her assertive older brother. She watched Blake, saw his barely concealed avarice, and felt a familiar, bitter resignation. And then there was Jonah, the youngest, the artist. He had always felt like an afterthought, a quiet footnote in the grand narrative of the Dawson family. While Blake inherited Arthur's business acumen and Lucy his kindness, Jonah had inherited his contemplative nature, a trait that was often mistaken for disinterest. He spent most of his time in the conservatory, watching the autumn leaves fall, feeling the chasm between himself and his siblings widen with every passing hour. The impending memorial, and the reading of the will that would follow, loomed not as a moment of closure, but as a final, formal confirmation of his place on the periphery. The day of the reading arrived cloaked in a cold, persistent drizzle. The family sat stiffly in the mahogany-paneled conference room of their father's lawyer, a man as dry and brittle as the old legal documents that covered his desk. Blake's leg jiggled with impatience. Lucy twisted a handkerchief in her lap. Jonah stared at a water stain on the ceiling, tracing its shape with his eyes. When the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, finally cleared his throat and began to read, the expected legal jargon soon gave way to the unexpected. Arthur's will was not a simple division of assets. While significant portions were left to Margaret and the children, a substantial, shocking percentage of the estate, including a portfolio of prime real estate, was bequeathed to the Maplewood Community Center. Arthur's voice, through the legal prose, spoke of a lifelong commitment to the town that had given him his start, a philanthropic gesture none of his children had ever known the true extent of. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's face was a mask of disbelief that quickly hardened into fury. The community center? He finally exploded, his voice echoing in the small room. That's absurd. I spent 15 years working by his side, building his legacy. I am his legacy. He can't have been of sound mind. Lucy, however, felt a different kind of shock. It was as if a window had been thrown open in a stuffy room. This unexpected act gave her a glimpse of a father she hadn't fully known, and a flicker of an idea, a future not defined by her brothers, began to ignite within her. For the first time, she didn't try to placate Blake. She simply said, "It was his money, Blake. He had a right to do what he wanted with it." Jonah felt a strange pang of connection to his father. He'd spent countless hours at that community center as a lonely teenager, finding solace in its underfunded art program. The bequest felt like a posthumous message, a secret shared only between them. The argument that began in the lawyer's office raged for days, poisoning the already sorrowful atmosphere of the house. Convinced there was a loophole or that his father had been unduly influenced, Blake insisted they hire a specialist. That's how Alex Carter entered their lives. Carter was not the aggressive litigator Blake had hoped for. He was a quiet, observant man in his late 30s who specialized in inheritance disputes. His reputation was built not on courtroom battles, but on his uncanny ability to understand the tangled emotional roots from which such conflicts grew. Alex Carter began not with ledgers and deeds, but with conversations. He listened to Blake's tirades about entitlement, Lucy's hesitant hopes for independence, and Jonah's quiet reflections on feeling invisible. He spent hours in Arthur's study, surrounded by the late patriarch's life. It was there, tucked inside a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, that he found it, a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with Arthur's elegant, sloping script, and it held not business dealings, but the man's soul. As Alex carefully read through the journal, the foundations of the Dawson family began to tremble. The revelations came not as a single earthquake, but as a series of devastating tremors. Alex arranged a meeting, presenting his findings with a calm, deliberate gravity. He first addressed Blake, producing not just journal entries, but corresponding bank statements he had uncovered. Years ago, Blake had borrowed a massive sum from his father to fund a tech startup that had failed spectacularly, a secret he had buried under a mountain of pride. Arthur had forgiven the debt, but his journal entry on the matter was filled with pain. "He has my ambition," Arthur wrote, "but not my caution. The hardest lesson for a son to learn is that his father's trust, once broken, is a fragile thing to mend." The blood drained from Blake's face. His self-righteous anger crumbled, replaced by the raw, humiliated shame of a long-hidden failure being brought into the light. Next, Alex turned to Lucy. He read aloud passages where Arthur described Margaret not just as his wife, but as his most trusted advisor, the strategic mind behind some of his most successful early investments. "They see my name on the buildings," one entry read, "but it was Maggie's vision that laid the cornerstone. She is the architect of our lives, and I am merely the builder." Lucy looked at her mother, who was staring at her hands, a faint, sad smile on her lips. In that moment, Lucy's perception of her own life, of her mother's life, shifted. She wasn't just the daughter of a great man. She was the daughter of a great woman whose strength had been silent, but monumental. Her own self-worth, so long tethered to her role as a caretaker, suddenly felt untethered, ready to find its own ground. Finally, Alex slid a simple cardboard box across the table to Jonah. His journal mentioned these. "I found them in the attic." The box was filled with letters. Dozens of them. Heartfelt, handwritten notes from people at the community center. A teenager thanking Arthur for the scholarship that allowed him to be the first in his family to attend college. A single mother thanking him for anonymously funding the daycare program so she could work. A group of elderly citizens thanking him for the new garden where they spent their afternoons. Jonah read them, tears blurring the words. He was holding the evidence of his father's hidden life, a life of quiet compassion that mirrored the deepest parts of his own identity. The revelations ignited a final, terrible confrontation. Blake, cornered and exposed, lashed out. Lucy, newly emboldened, stood her ground. Jonah, finding his voice, defended his father's true legacy. The argument escalated, their voices rising in the grand foyer, a cacophony of pain, greed, and dawning understanding. And in the center of the storm, Margaret stood up, her face pale. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stop." She clutched her chest, her eyes wide with pain, and collapsed to the marble floor. The sound of her body falling, followed by the sickening crack of a teacup shattering, instantly silenced the rage. In its place was a new, more profound, and terrifying silence. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital waiting room was a harsh antidote to their conflict. The fight was gone, burned away by the cold fire of fear. For hours, they sat together, the silence between them no longer hostile, but fragile, filled with the shared terror of losing the one person who held their fractured world together. When the doctor finally emerged to tell them Margaret was stable, that the heart attack was mild but a serious warning, the collective exhale of relief was a prayer. In the quiet days that followed, as Margaret recovered, the siblings finally talked. Really talked. With Alex's gentle guidance, they laid their weapons down. In the quiet hospital cafeteria, Blake finally admitted his failures, his voice cracking as he spoke of the immense pressure he felt to measure up to their father. Lucy spoke of her desire to build something of her own, to honor their mother's hidden strength by discovering her own. And Jonah, with the box of letters on the table between them, talked about the legacy of kindness he now understood was worth more than any fortune. They weren't just arguing about money. They were fighting their own fears: fear of failure, fear of being invisible, fear of not being loved for who they were. A week later, they walked through the doors of the Maplewood Community Center together. They saw the children in the daycare Margaret's vision had helped fund. They met the teenager from the letter, now home from his first year of college. They saw the vibrant garden where the elderly citizens sat laughing in the sun. It was all real. It was tangible. That afternoon, they signed the papers, not only honoring their father's bequest, but creating a new Dawson Family Foundation to expand it, with Lucy as its director. Blake would lend his business expertise, humbled and wiser, and Jonah would run a new, fully funded arts program. That evening, back in the house that no longer felt like a tomb, they gathered in the study. Jonah pulled out an old family photo album, and as they looked at a picture of a much younger Arthur, a man with his arms around his 3 small children, they shared stories. They laughed. They cried. They began to piece together the fragments of their father's legacy, realizing it was never about the money or the estate. It was about the love he had nurtured, the values he had quietly lived, and the family he had built. A family that had almost shattered, but was now, finally, beginning to heal.